Hi, and welcome to the Designing Planets panel. I'm Rob McCrary, the creative director for Starfinder, and I don't know which direction we're going to go in.
No. Both at the same time. One,
okay, two, three.
I'm Joe Piscini, the lead designer for Starfinder.
And I'm Jason Keeley, and I'm not going to fall for that. Also developer on Starfinder, working primarily on the adventure paths.
So we're here to talk about designing planets, and when we say designing planets, we mean designing planets and worlds and moons and galaxies and kind of settings overall, but kind of planets are the core of a big science fantasy setting like Starfinder. So
think of us as the engineers of Magrathea.
Ooh.
Deep cut, maybe.
Those fjords were really nice.
Thank you.
Yeah. Who wants to?
I know what you're talking about.
It's cool. It's also early-ish. Mm-hmm. So, designing planets. We have lots of planets in Starfinder. Sounds really stupid now, but there's a whole galaxy. So we've done, we've detailed some stuff on the Pact Worlds planets themselves. In the Starfinder Adventure Path, we have the Codex of Worlds, and in every volume, there's a new little planet that you can populate your galaxy with. And I guess we're just going to give some tips and stuff, so I should stop introductorying. And who wants to start with a tip on designing planets? Or none of us are scientists, I'll say that.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So we don't actually know how planets are formed, other than what Google tells us. But we have a science fantasy setting, so we can kind of hand wave some stuff.
Yeah. I think the first thing you want to start off, if you want to design your own planet, say you're writing a Codex of Worlds for whatever reason, and I think you want to start off with a hook, maybe two, but no more than that, and just sort of think about that. What is this planet? Is it a planet of sentient trees? Is it a weird donut world? Is it a completely flat world where gravity goes backwards or something like that? And that from there you can just sort of branch off and then start thinking about whether or not you want to deal with the physics, right, of it, or is this more, since we have a science, fantasy world, is this more going to be because of magic? So you don't have to necessarily worry about, is does G equals M over R squared? If it's a weird donut world where gravity is weird, you don't need to worry about that. Yeah.
What is the G equals
That's the sort of
M over R squared?
That is the formula that we generally try to use to make sure that the gravity of a planet kind of matches its size and mass, and that is G is the gravity, M is mass, and R is radius squared. So what we do when we print a Codex of Worlds, sort of like little planet stat block, basically, we say in relation to a Galarian/Earth size world, times 1, times 1.5, times 2 for all three of those things. And one of the things that at least I do when I develop something, if it looks like it's not it's not a woohoo wahoo planet, I'll make sure that those numbers add up. And you can just use those those placements. You don't have to figure out the exact radius of Earth and then multiply that times 2 to do the math. You can just use the times 2. So if it were let's say mass of 1 size Galarian, but it's a radius of 2, you multiply that 4, 1/4 gravity there would be 0.25. Easy as math.
The numbers in front of your face.
Yes, I definitely.
Earth is 1 is basically, so it's all based on that. And another easy way to do that, if you want to get those details down, which we have done, is you just look at existing planets in our solar system. So in the Pact Worlds, there's a lot of analogs between the Pact Worlds and our solar system. So Akaton shockingly has the exact same gravity and mass and radius as Mars, and Castrofel is exactly the same as Venus. So we know that scientifically works because it seems to work in our solar system. So that's kind of some of the as scientific as we get usually with our planets.
That's a lot of physical characteristics. There's also how long a day and a year is. You can play with that to get weird results. We have a Pact world that doesn't rotate relative to the sun, so one side is always hot and exposed to the sun, and the other's dark. And then there's a ring of habitableness in the middle. We've talked a lot about physical characteristics. I think I enjoy that too, but the most fun for me is who lives there, what's going on, what's weird about it, which can be one of the hooks or not. The physical nature of the world can be a hook, certainly, but if you just have a terrestrial planet, with a few continents and some oceans of some variety, it might not be water, could be something else, but the societies that live there, how long have they been there? There's so many things to cover.
Yeah.
That's just why you're here and why we're here. But a few things I like to think about are what's the level in a science fantasy setting, especially what is the science and what is the fantasy? How much technology is there? What kind of technology is there? Is it super focused? Is it very steampunk? Is it like, you know, a few years from present day Earth kind of technology? Is it Stone Age stuff? And then same with magic. You know, is it are people used to seeing spellcasters walk down the street or have they never seen a spell cast in their life, and your mending is going to freak them out and have them chasing you off the planet, or even your starship, going back to technology. And there's a few other things, but I don't want to keep babbling.
Well, of course, on a whole planet, you could obviously have all of these things, or a huge mixture of these things, because there's different countries and everything. But one thing that's difficult about that when you're playing with a setting as vast as Starfinder is, if you drill down into super detail, I mean, you could spend forever detailing every nation state and every enclave on a given planet and everything. And then if your players go visit a spaceport, buy some gear, and then leave, everything you've done is just like, well, what's the point? So it's kind of thinking in terms about the scope of what you want your setting. If you know you want to set your game or an adventure on a single planet, that's worth detailing it a bit more. If it's really just a stopover or a story element, you don't need to go into that. You can have kind of one hook for the whole planet, and, you know, maybe think about creating one settlement or one nation that might be the place where where the characters visit, and just kind of, you know, maybe jot down a few ideas for the rest of the world if you need to add some extra detail. But you don't necessarily need to do everything. And that's kind of what we do in our stuff. I mean, the Codex of Worlds are one-page entries, so that's really just a big overview of a planet. In our Packed Worlds book, we go into a bit more detail, but it's still, we're talking about, okay, here's the overall planet, here's the overall political situation, here's a few notable locations, adventure sites, cities, nations, but we can't cover everything, because you could do, you know, entire books about one single planet.
Or what we might end up doing is drilling down, like what we did with we have Verces in the Past Worlds, and then we kind of eventually drilled down onto their capital city of Kuvakara, and we had a whole article on that in one of the adventure paths. So you can always get like more focused on a thing, and like Rob said, if you're doing this for yourself, feel free to, you know, and you have all the time in the world, feel free to, you know, write up an entire galaxy of planets. But if you're only writing 500 words for one of us, then, you know, we want you to we want the overview so that people can take it and add their own details if they need.
Planets are enormous, right? I mean,
yes.
Let's state the obvious multiple times.
I mean, I've never seen one.
Yeah. I mean,
so
me either. Who knows?
Who knows how big they are?
But I think it's a fair temptation to say, like, this is the jungle world.
Yeah.
And you know, if you're looking for someone on this planet and you come here with your ship, you're going to happen to land within a few miles of them or something, and that's fine. One thing I like to do is think about, you know, on the jungle world, like maybe there's one really big industrial city, like something that's really antithetical to the kind of theme of that world, and how does that interact with the rest of the environment and the rest of the creatures there? Or if it's, you know, an evil, hellacious planet, you know, populated by devils, but there's some like bastion of heaven in there, or trying to make their way up from beneath the earth in kind of a flip. I don't know. I'm just I think I'm top of my head.
It's good riffing.
But yeah, and that's what I like to do is we sit near each other and we'll often just throw ideas back and forth, just talking with people, and also conflict. Ideas that don't seem to work well together are a great source for we're good at solving problems and retconning things, like we as human beings, I mean, and justifying things that don't make any sense. So that can be really helpful in world building, I think.
Oh yeah. It'll spark your imagination if you just literally like maybe spin a dial or roll a die and pick two things. I don't know why I picked dial, because we're all role-playing gamers and we all have dials, right, in our pockets right now.
The game of life.
It's on our analog starship with dials and switches.
You roll a couple dice or something, and, you know, maybe make a chart and then roll a couple dice on it and pick two things and then just jam them together, and then there you go. You've got a world that probably could get a dozen plot hooks out of that.
Okay, can we just talk about this now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, Starfinder accessory coming out at the end of this year that I'm like trying. Sorry, I said that I would wait until you told me to talk about it. So we're coming out with an accessory called the Deck of Many Worlds. That's going to be 100 world cards that you can use to generate a bunch of worlds of your own.
When is that? When is that coming out?
Great question. November, December.
Probably December of this year.
Yeah. And I brought real rough prototypes that should be far enough away that you can't be unsold on them based on my terrible drawings. But But Sarah Robinson and Sonia Morris, some of our excellent art folks, are working right now. I think Sonia's back home in Seattle, making it pretty look great. But the basic premise is that on the front you'll have art of a world, and that can be like we were talking about Earth-like planets, or maybe there might be a donut world in there and a flat one, but a lot of gas giants and stuff you might actually find in space. And then some physical characteristics like the gravity, the atmosphere, some biomes that you might find there. All suggestions, right, for what just to spark your ideas. And then on the back is where things get kind of bonkers, because on the bottom here, you probably can't see, but there are 6 categories, 6 attributes for the world that are going to be like technology, magic, alignment, which I'll admit that I'm not the biggest fan of alignment when it gets used to like cram people into a box, like you're lawful neutral and that means you do exactly this all the time. But I found it really helpful for world generation. Of course, the whole planet isn't going to be chaotic good, but if that's kind of like, thinking of you're approaching a planet with your starship, like how do they treat you? How does the first ship greet you? That kind of thing. I think it's helpful for that. So on the back, in the middle here, there's this bar that lines up with the attributes, and they have up arrows and down arrows and flat arrows, and that will tell you, for example, if there's an up arrow under the technology, that tells you this is a high-tech world. And there might be a down arrow under magic, and that tells you it's a low magic world. And all of these are arranged in a unique order, so any card back with any card front will generate a different set of attributes like that. We also have a hook on the card back, so you'll want to draw 2 of these, and then you'll have 2 totally different hooks that combine in different ways to give you yet more ideas. And then finally, there are some numbers here that are kind of like 2d6, and they can tell you how many creatures live on the world, which we have in the upper corner here. Something that's really exciting is as of Alien Archive 3, which comes out this month, we'll have more than 100 playable species in Starfinder like from our APs and organized play and our hardcovers. And those are all, they will be soon, but many of them are already on our system resource document, sfrd.info, I want to say. So, just having an image of who might live there. And then there's also on the other side, threat species, which this I want you to see the art for. It's like a cool squiggly alien that we don't have yet, so I'm just going to put that out. We should probably
let's get one of that.
This.
It doesn't look like any IP infringing
no, it doesn't
at all.
I think Sarah will probably order new art for that anyway, so I'm sorry, Joe.
Whatever. And these are all existing monsters too, and some of them might be sapient. The other point being for these is that these are the creatures on the planet that are likely to have, or world, because it might be a space station, that are likely to have societies and civilizations and talk to you rather than try to kill you. So with 100 cards and all that crap I just talked about, that's like millions of possible combinations. So I'm super excited about it. I've been talking to everyone at the office like nonstop. My poor roommate is just like, please, December, let's get this out there. But yeah, I'd love to talk about that more if anyone has any questions. But that's it's been framing my thinking about creating worlds for a long time. Like we were talking about magic and tech and the physical characteristics and sort of conflict and how that can give you ideas. Yeah,
we were really excited when Joe brought the idea up too, because it's Joe and Jason. I think were the ones you both. I don't remember.
No, it was mostly just Joe.
Was it? Yeah. Okay.
I think so. I don't know.
Well, whichever. But it was just like because we have this whole galaxy, and it's like you want to do it for a game. If you just want to create it where maybe your players decide to go like, let's just punch the button and go into the drift and come out somewhere because they're crazy like that. You can then use this kind of thing to create whatever random world they do. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact about that it has the alien species, because we didn't really talk about that for a world. Like we talked about the physical characteristics, but it's also like who lives on a planet is probably the most important thing, well, one of the most important things. Mm-hmm. So, are they a sapient species, or is it all just a bunch of, creatures that don't have any intelligence or civilization? That makes for very different worlds. Or if they're shared by, multiple sapient species, how does that, again, with the conflict, how does that change up the world? Or is it, a single species that inhabits this world or multiple worlds, to have a whole huge interplanetary civilization? Those are the kind of things that can, there's so many different little variables, and I think you were talking about the dials and stuff, that you can adjust to just make all new planets, and these cards will help with that quite a bit.
Yeah, going back to that a little bit, with just the physical characteristics and the 2 hooks that kind of interact, that's like 900,000 combinations. And once you add the species in, it's like millions and billions. And different species on the same like planet with the same hooks kind of makes a big difference to me. Like if you take Earth, right, boring old Earth, and you replace all the humans with contemplatives, like giant floating brains that could fly around, and I don't know, all our zoo animals with like pterodactyl-sized needle mouth, needle-faced
pterodactyls, yes,
that are trying to suck the brains out of it. That kind of changes the tenor of like what it would be like to be here on Earth.
Definitely.
So
I think it'd be pretty close.
maybe in some respects.
I can just see all the contemplatives like cramming into a subway.
Yeah. One contemplative with white gloves just pushing everyone.
Yeah.
Tiny white gloves.
And indeed, if like you're not currently running a game or thinking about making your own setting, these cards could also be good for like writing prompts. If you yourself are like a writer, you just go like throw these things together and then go like, oh look, this is a you know a space station where there's a wormhole nearby, and then there's a religious faction that wants to take over the wormhole. Don't use that idea because that was a TV show.
Space Nine,
but you got it. You've solved my riddle. Poof, I'm gone. But if you put those together, and maybe you can write up some of your own stuff.
There's advice in it's a 110 card deck, so 10 of the cards show you how to use the deck and give you ideas for other things like generating settlements or even non-player characters or your own player character, right? Because if you really want to go wild, you could draw cards to see what your character is like. And you can also generate your home world, right? If you want to be an interesting character from outside like the core setting of Starfinder, or if you in a homebrew setting, it would be great for that.
One thing we don't have on here, right? It doesn't say whether that's in the near space or the vast, or right? That's sort of up to you. Yeah, depending on what you want, where you want it to be.
In case you're not familiar, do you want to real quick talk about the packed worlds, near space, and the vast?
Yeah. So how many people here have played Starfinder? Or pretty. Okay, some people haven't. So our core setting it's set in a galaxy, but obviously, as we've mentioned, a galaxy is a huge place. So we've kind of brought in the focus, and the center of our setting is the packed worlds, and this is the solar system that used to contain Galarian, for those of you familiar with Pathfinder, but Galarian has disappeared. It's all safe, all the gods say, but no one will say what happened to it. But Galarian is somewhere else, and in its place is a space station called Absalom Station. So if you're familiar with the Pathfinder book, Distant Worlds, that describe that solar system, it is that solar system just catapulted forward into the future. So that's kind of the core of our setting. But then of course it's a big galaxy. And so we have I kind of view it as like 3 concentric circles of the sort of, as you go farther and farther out. So you have the one solar system of the packed worlds, and then there's near space and the vast. And those are basically, it's not a measure of physical distance, it's a measure of how easy they are to get to using drift beacons, which is how you travel through the hyperspace dimension called the drift. So planets or systems that have a higher density of drift beacons are easier to get to, so they're considered part of near space, and the places that really don't have a whole lot of drift beacons are the vast. And you might end up having like a system in the vast could be only a couple of light years from the packed worlds, but just because there's no drift beacons, it's actually much harder to get to. And I guess the only other thing is the Absalom Station has the Star Stone in the center of it that sort of powers it, and that also acts as a super powerful drift beacon. So anywhere in the galaxy, you can always get back to Absalom Station by homing in on the Star Stone. It only takes like 26 days. Yep. So that's kind of our main thing. So that's kind of one thing we also decide too, is where we want to put if we're going to create a world, we're not going to put it in the packed worlds because that is literally just a single solar system, and it's weird to add a new planet suddenly. And there's already like 11 there, so
many. It's like,
and space
planets,
and a colony ship, and the sun. People live in the sun.
Yeah,
and,
as you do.
So we kind of think about that, and then it's interesting because of course you don't usually just have a planet by itself. So it can be good if you want to create like a whole new system besides the planet. Think about the solar system that this planet is in, and what are the different types of planets. The packed worlds is, I would say, highly inhabited because virtually every planet, I think every planet inhabited. Some of the moons may not be, but but obviously you could have like planets that don't have as many people on it or that kind of stuff, and maybe there's, like I said, an interplanetary civilization that's conquered several planets.
And these cards have the 2d6 I mentioned. We give you advice that if you want to generate a whole system, you can just draw a card, and this would be, for example, 7. There's 7 worlds in that system, and then you draw 7 of these cards, and then go ham if you want. It's I mean, I will be.
Just full on have a full like conspiracy wall style thing
Yes,
with cards
exactly.
everywhere,
Yep.
and then you tie
Thread
yarn
going-
between
yep,
them.
exactly.
And
Oh, I will be doing that. Yes. I'll
Oh,
probably
no.
go into your cube a little
No.
bit, so just be ready.
what have I done?
What else?
Yeah, what else?
Another thing I think would be inspiration, because there's if you have whole planets and galaxies and everything, it's like, well, how do I know what to choose? It's like, where can you look for inspiration? So obviously with like the deck of many worlds, you can just piece together all sorts of things. But space stations near wormholes and stuff. I mean, you can get inspiration from anywhere, and we're certainly inspired by science fiction. We try not to copy things directly because that's bad, but for at least published things in your home game, if you want to put a Cardassian space station next to a wormhole.
I never said Cardassian.
I didn't either.
And you can just rename stuff, right? Especially if your players watch the same media as you do, just change a couple details and they'll have no idea, maybe. And in Starfinder core rulebook, people have been coming up to the booth and talking about Starfinder, and I show them the inspirational media we have in the back of the core rulebook. It's like 2 pages of just film and television and literature and comics and other RPGs, like this huge list that I'm still working through myself, just getting inspired by a whole range of awesome sci-fi fantasy stuff.
This is a quick funny story. Some of your players might recognize it because I took a mission from Red Dead Redemption 2 and put it on Absalom Station and changed all the creatures and all that. And one of my players that day was like, "You stole that from Red Dead Redemption." I was like, "Ah, yes." But they played along,
right?
What?
They're like, then they feel good. They're
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
oh,
that's
I know
true.
that.
Sure.
I'm
Everyone
like,
thought,
yeah,
"Oh, it's fun. It's fun. It's still fun." And they knew where it was. The trick at the end was like, oh, it was basically like the guy who has like 3. This traveling zoo and 3 of the crazy creatures are missing, and the Tashtari laser wolf is just an actual dog with a flashlight strapped to his chest. But the last thing is a real monster, right? And they're like,
real monsters.
yes, real monsters.
Are there any inspirations that you guys have that, like, in terms of designing worlds and stuff that you've drawn on before? Ooh, put you on the spot.
Oh yeah, put me on the spot. In terms of inspirations for Starfinder and possibly the planets too, I like Farscape a lot, and I like to have the idea of lots of weird creatures and weird civilizations and things that you go to this planet and it's a weird work camp that everyone's on drugs and hippie loving it, but yet they work it every day and they party like every night is Friday, but the next day they go to work again, and stuff like that is I think really good.
For me, weirdly, Guardians of the Galaxy, there's not a lot of worlds that I'm familiar with in that setting, but some of like giant skulls. And really just like the interaction of many different kinds of creatures. I always think of that on worlds, and that's like really interesting to me, is how radically different societies get along or don't, or do and don't. I think that's fun.
Star Wars is a good example of the sort of one-word descriptor for a planet, because Tatooine is the desert planet and Coruscant is the city planet, and so that can be a good thing. I'm also really interested in like the political things when you start to expand out to this scale. So I'm a huge fan of the Expanse series, and that's all takes place in a single solar system, but there's all these political things between Earth and Mars and the outer planets. And again, you can look at something like Star Wars too and just see these sort of big political things, and that again brings in that conflict, those hooks to tell stories. So you can kind of like the level of detail that you want to put into it is really up to you, and how much you feel that like if you're running a game for people, how much detail they're going to interact with. I usually try to.
Sorry, I'm just thinking of Star Wars and how someone decided to taste the dirt. Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
What? No.
Yeah, the salt.
Yeah, just like the rebel, they're ready to fight for their lives, and one guy's just like, well, this planet I haven't been on, let me taste the dirt. It's like
These weird
salt.
crystals.
It's like, maybe that's a planet that compels you to taste all of it. I don't know. Sorry. Anyway, go on, please.
Now I want to make a character that tastes the dirt on every planet he goes to.
That's fan trees that roll around, right? Because they taste through their
No, they don't taste through their roller balls.
All right, so what were you saying, Rob?
I totally forgot now. It's just, it's sort of about, I'm trying to think of how to express it, because I try to look at like what's the level of detail that I need for my game. So I kind of talked about this before, but it's like if I know the PCs are going to a spaceport and that's the primary place they're going on this planet, that's where I want to put the most detail in, and then just sort of build the structure of the planet and society around that. And if I know that they're never going to go somewhere else on that planet, I don't need to. And it's the same thing. If they're not going to go to other planets in that solar system, I don't need anything but the briefest ideas, like, oh, there's 7 planets in this solar system, and sun is red, or yellow, you know, whatever. And it's kind of just getting a sense of how much detail you need for your game and how much detail you want to create.
Yeah, and another thing about creating worlds like with this or any other system you have for making that kind of thing is, you know, is the whole point of your campaign or adventure that world, like, and interacting with it, or is it the backdrop for something else? Like, are they there just to get a MacGuffin and then head somewhere else? Or are they there because their ship crashed there, because they need to refuel or meet one person and then take off? Like, that totally changes how much detail you might want to put into it and how it even it affects your players. The other thing is, and I've always done this because I'm a pretty lazy GM, is use my players, game master, use my players to come up with ideas. And the collaborative storytelling. If you have a group, that's what I was talking about, bouncing ideas off of each other. But if you're literally all around the table telling a shared story together, you might as well ask your players, like, well, what do you see? Or like, why is it that that person just tasted the ground, you know? Like, and they might have a great idea, and it just, there's so much buy-in that way. Everybody's invested in the same world together. One of my favorite things to do, not just because I'm lazy, but but partially.
All right, we can open it up to questions now. If anybody has anything, we're happy to, if you want like more specific tips or something else. Looks like we may have something from Twitch here.
All right.
Or not. No, turn the microphone on. Any questions from anyone?
You guys have a preferred or favorite biome to work in? Do you like working on a planet that's a lot of desert, one that's mostly ice, all city? Do you have one you like working in best that you think's more creative to work with?
For me, jungle is I'm like a little exhausted of jungle, but there's just, you know, so many possibilities because everyone's used to the idea that there's a lot of different kinds of life there, including plant life. But you can also have things that shouldn't be in a jungle there, and that is just more interesting because it shouldn't be there. That's, if I had to pick a biome, it would be that or urban. Obviously, I really like urban in a science fantasy setting.
I really like jungle too because I've read like a lot of the old pulp sci-fi where it's the jungles and swamps of Venus and everything, and that was just always really cool. That I thought, you know, it's like a whole planet like that, but and weirdly also the urban thing too, but particularly like on a space station. Like Absalom Station is a space station. I think its population is about what New York has, but it's just like you can put in so many different things, just like in any other kind of city, except you're in a space station. So it kind of adds, you know, and even with Absalom Station, there's this armada of ships outside. It's almost like a whole extra city in orbit around the station that you can do anything with, and so.
And it's three-dimensional too, which is really cool.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got like the spike where all like it's kind of like the social strata goes down the same way that is. That's but there's also like monsters and stuff that have just gotten lost down there. So that's a really cool thing for me.
I'll have to third urban a bit, but especially stuff that's cities that are maybe like built on older cities, so you can also kind of have a little bit of verticality, but down have those, you know, dungeony sewers and stuff like that, like the same way like you know, Seattle's kind of built on older Seattle's, or London is kind of built on older versions of London, and kind of I like enjoy like a wasteland, a good Mad Max Marsy kind of wasteland. You know, there's not much there, but you can kind of have fun, like settlements built out of junk and stuff like that.
Yeah, I'm just curious, when you guys are coming up with ideas for worlds for your campaigns, not just you know, a quick set of you know, worlds that maybe you could generate for a solar system, whatever, but when you're actually trying to keep track of all the politics, all the characters, all the races, all the terrain, the gravity, you know, there's a lot of like tools of the trade to do those sorts of things, to sort of organize them and keep track of all that stuff, right? Things like World Anvil, Scrivener, these kinds of tools. What do you guys use? I'm just really curious, what are the tools of your craft?
Piles of books on our desk and each other's brains.
In a lot of ways, yes.
And one way we set ourselves up for success that way is by starting smaller, right? Like the core rulebook has small, I always forget the page count exactly, but we talk about all of the Pact Worlds. And then we had a book called the Pact Worlds, where we talked more about all the Pact Worlds and detailed some of the settlements there and some of the moons a little bit more. And then we do Alien Archives, where we talk about some of the creatures that we name dropped 2 or 3 books back and expand on them. And so gradually building that way, and then just being there and knowing where things kind of came from organically, and having written a lot of it ourselves and knowing the people who did. And Yeah, we could sure use a wiki. The system reference document's really handy that we have.
There is a Starfinder wiki. It's not
Yes.
done by volunteers.
An internal
and
wiki,
stuff.
yeah, so that we can have all our
exactly.
secrets in there. Like people don't know this, but
A lot of our stuff is written by freelancers, and so we develop that, but we assign like, hey, we need this new planet, and we'll give them varying levels of guidance on exactly if we need something super specific, we'll be a lot more detailed. Or it's like we just need a new planet, do something cool, and so then we don't actually have to worry about the tools to make that kind of thing. We just make sure that it's still cool and fits into the overall setting.
Yeah, well, like when we do the freelancers give someone a city and a planet that we've already detailed, we detail them more. We'll give them the tools. We'll figure out, we'll write an outline and be like, these are the things you need to read first to make it match up. So in a lot of ways, Control F is our biggest friend. We open up PDFs and just sort of search for, make sure to keywords and whatnot. And then we all have whiteboards on our desks too, and I'm constantly jotting notes on there to remember something later on. So yeah, it's a chaotic mess in a lot of ways.
Pretty low tech tools, actually.
Yeah.
incredibly organized.
And like
Hold on,
yeah,
World
hand-drawn
Anvil.
photos.
Write that down.
So as far as designing planets, you mentioned like the gravity of Earth and all that sort of thing. Is there anything like any types of space phenomena that you tend to avoid near planets, like for instance wormholes or all that sort of stuff? Not necessarily anything that's already been done before, but more just like hazards that could like threaten planets in space and stuff like that.
We haven't done much with that, I don't think, unless.
Yeah, we use what we need to do for the story that we want to tell, basically. But we're not going to necessarily populate. You don't want a bunch of hazards near a planet that's populated by a bunch of people, because all those hazards will kill those people, right? So
Like all of the people.
all of the people.
The scale is so big
Exactly.
that it's.
So you're not like, unless you want the planet to be a bunch of meteors hitting it all the time, and then that informs the setting essentially.
But you did that black hole, that thing near a
Yes,
black hole.
right, exactly.
early
That was early on. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a planet that was sort of near a black hole, and they were studying it, and they realized they were going to get sucked in. So half the planet was like, "What we'll do? Here was what we'll do. We'll build a bunch of big jet engine on our planet and shoot ourselves into the black hole early and get the science." And then the other half was like, "What the heck, no!" And so they went off, and they're on a moon base as their comrades have jetted into the black hole.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about that, right? Is
Yeah.
that not a lot, but there are several hooks in here. One is like there's constantly in the card thing, there's constantly bombardment from some kind of natural phenomenon, or there's a gravitational anomaly in the core of the planet threatening to consume it. And one of the other things you can do that the deck talks about is set these things in the past or the present or the future. So it could be that there was a meteor that was going to end all life on the planet, but now there's not. Like, how does that change the society? Probably pretty drastically if everyone thought they were going to die, and then they woke up like, oh, it missed us. Well, this is awkward. I guess I owe you that money after all. Or if they just found out about it and they were this utopian world, and it's like, oh no, this is all, it's just radically different. So just using it like a tool, and like on that planet you just described, like different people will react differently, and it creates a lot of stories.
Next question.
So you kind of just answered it by talking about the past, present, or future, but one of the big themes in more towards science fiction that seem really cool with this is actually completely uninhabited space and venturing forth for the fetch quests or whatever into the unknown, kind of like Interstellar is what's going through my mind right now. So how would you recommend like either using the deck or not using the deck for generating like completely unpopulated hostile environments?
Well, in terms of this deck, there's a lot of advice on just do whatever you want. So you can ignore, if you want an unpopulated world, you can just ignore the species, just not put any species on it. And you can still think about what do the hooks mean in that case. And they're not all to do with the creatures necessarily that live there. It could be phenomenon or some other thing, like it phases in and out of the ethereal plane or something like that. So it's kind of the rule of RPGs is do whatever you think is cool, and don't worry about like
And it's kind of like, especially for the weirdness factor, because like this is primarily designed to create planets. But like I was just looking at this little thing. We've got a gas giant with rings, and it's like, well, what if there was just rings and no gas giant in the middle of them or something? And it's like look for those little bits and then put them together. I think can make the kind of really weird, non-standard stuff.
It's a little easier and a lot more fun to think of the weird thing first, and then figure out why that might be happening scientifically or magically or something like that. You know.
And I actually asked for some of the art on this. I asked, can you draw us like an Earth-like planet, like kind of normal looking, but then one really weird feature? And I didn't give any other guidance than that, and we got some really cool stuff that looks like it could be a bunch of different things going on that you can just make up. So it's exciting.
So we have a question from Twitch chat from user Shadzar. What are the differences that you encounter when you design man-made bodies like a Death Star versus a natural planet?
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of want to think a little bit scientifically, like a big old Dyson Sphere. It has to be, X large to actually fit people on the inside of it, right? That's reminding me that the gentleman who the Dyson Sphere is named after, I think hates it. He's like, that's the dumbest idea that I had. I had like 18 ideas, and you latched onto the Dyson Sphere. Put my name on something else.
They got vacuums and stuff, right?
That's a different guy. I was doing some research on that, and that's when I found out. And I was like, oh, that's pretty funny. I mean, space stations, or man-made, are constructed things, and you can kind of do a little bit whatever you want because you're in space and there's no gravity, so you can kind of jam anything you want to.
Well, you can do artificial gravity. You don't have to worry about.
And then you get like when you're
over r squared because
exactly.
It's like woo, artificial gravity.
But when you're putting it when you put something together up in space, you can lift. You can move gigantic things, right? You don't have to necessarily build it tiny brick by brick.
Did you just talk about the Expanse and how they build skyscraper-like ships?
No, I didn't, but that's a good thing.
I learned that from you. Yeah. It's kind of a cool idea that, since the ships are constructed in space and never land on planets, they don't need to make sense like as something that would exist in gravity ever.
Yeah.
The other thing between like a constructed environment and a natural one is just intentionality, like who built it, why, how long ago, are they still there, is it different people now? And then with a natural environment, how does the geography and the physical characteristics change how creatures interact? Like, have they never met each other because there's just this impossibly tall mountain range in between, just all the normal stuff we know from real life.
Populations is also something to think about there because obviously a planet can hold millions or billions of people and you don't really have to think that up. But when you're talking about a constructed thing like a space station, it's like, well, how many people would actually fit on here? And I know when we were doing Absalom Station, because the first adventure we published was Incident at Absalom Stations, we had to do a whole big article in the Adventure Path about that, and we're like, well, how many people would this hold? And it's like, well, if we kind of take New York and stretch it out and pack people in really closely, but it's still, it clearly couldn't hold as many people as a whole planet will. And so that's the kind of thing. You're obviously going to have a much smaller population. I mean, a Death Star, I don't know how many people a Death Star would hold, but it's...
Someone does.
Someone does, yeah.
So when you guys were going from Pathfinder to Starfinder and you had the worlds that you had made for Pathfinder, how was the decision made for how to change societies and things? How was the decision made, what to change, what to keep the same?
It was pretty organic. Our original creative director, James Sutter, originally wrote the Distant Planets thing for Pact World. So he's the one who created all those planets originally. And then when we were talking about doing it, it's like, okay, well, what do we want to do differently? And we just had meetings where we just kind of threw out ideas to see what's cool if we advance this. And a good example of that is the planet of Aposte, which in Pathfinder it's mainly been sealed. It was an old ship that was possibly an old ship that was brought in there and inhabited by these weird aliens and everything. And we kind of had this sense that, well, we didn't quite know what to do with those aliens at the beginning. So it's like, well, what if they all died and somebody else has taken over control of that planet? And then we were like, oh, the Drow are there and they're arms dealers delving into that thing. And so those ideas just kind of came out, and then we eventually even took those aliens.
Yeah, and we have the gift of the Gap too, which is the galaxy-wide event that wiped memory for some very long period of time. And so anything that so some things could have advanced quite a bit, and some might be the same. Some might have been different and then changed without anyone knowing because they can't remember. So that was definitely a helpful sort of reset button.
And it was also looking at what things we wanted to keep. So Triaxis has this whole thing between the Riforians and the dragons and the humanoids that live on there, and that was something in Pathfinder. I was like, well, that's kind of cool. I mean, this is still a science fantasy setting. We want dragons in space, and it's like, well, and there used to be in Pathfinder people that would ride on these dragons, and it's like, well, that's not really feasible now. But what if you you and your dragon are now like co-pilots on a starship, and that created the Skyfire Legion that came out of Triaxis. So that's kind of just evolving a concept that was already there.
And the dragons running mega corporations. It's pretty cool.
Oh
too.
yeah.
So in this culture of people who are at Gen Con, there are things that almost are unwritten rules, like what a gnome looks like, what a golem looks like, or types of dragons and things like that. And then in the real world, we have scientific laws. How much of that do you feel like when you break those norms, do you feel like you need to explain, or just let them be different and bother the masses?
Including the question asker, perhaps. Like some people really, very little, I think. I think it's always fun to find scientific backing for cool ideas and be inspired by those things. Like I just have a big book of nature stuff. It has a better name than that, but it's just, and sometimes, like, honestly, we give references when we're ordering art, and it's like, kind of make it look like this, but it's a creature. And some things I've looked at and be like, well, that's too weird. No one will buy that this is a real thing, even though it is a real thing. So I don't send it as reference. Like the inside of certain fruits are just like really too alien. Like you would not believe it. But so it's nice when you have, like, well, I guess we can't talk about that yet. But sometimes we're like, oh, we want to do this cool thing. Does it make sense scientifically? No, it really doesn't. But it's cool enough that this we'll pull the science fantasy lever and have our cool thing in our game. And hopefully it doesn't bother people too much.
We try to at least make things plausible, or that we think would be plausible, but having the fact that it's that there is magic in the setting, and that it's, there's gods and demons and devils running around. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy things that could happen, but I find it works interesting from the other way too. Jason and I we've been trying to create this new alien race, and we're trying to figure out what it looks like. And all of our references are, of course, from Earth. And it's like, well, we want these to be alien, but we don't really know. So we were kind of like piecing together with our art director.
We put a real Frankenstein's monster.
We kind of want this kind of thing, and kind of put these.
So many
see how
pictures.
the art comes out,
Yeah.
but. It's just it's interesting because I also feel sometimes constrained because our worldview is literally our world, and we don't know what alien life actually looks like.
And going back to planet building and world building, you can go either direction. You can say this lava planet with this unrealistic feature, like what kind of creatures would be adapted to that environment? Or I want a creature that looks like this weird thing. What kind of world does it make sense that it would live in? Either that it constructed for itself or that it evolved to be adapted to. So
yeah, I think we can often get away with a sentence, if we just say like, because of a rift to the elemental plane of fire, ... lava world, right? So being science fantasy,
that's a direct quote from one of our friends.
Yes, you've been reading my manuscripts. And so it hopefully that gives us enough leeway that people can just sort of like, oh, that's plausible, nod and enjoy whatever it is we're writing.
Sorry, I just had one more question.
No.
As far as I'm in a D&D group, but I also am GMing Starfinder, and there's one person I'm trying to get to talk into Starfinder, but she just says, it's just too sci-fi for me. I'm not sci-fi person, but I explain to her constantly that it's like, oh, it's both. I mean, how do you kind of differentiate between what to keep and what to scratch as far as the balance between sci-fi and fantasy?
Whatever your group wants, if your player's saying they're not into sci-fi, I wouldn't try to trick them or convince them into, no, you really like sci-fi, I promise. That dragon's a robot, but you like dragons. I don't know. It really is like any role-playing game or any game, really. You got to have buy-in from everyone and agree on what you think is cool. And there's a lot of crossover, I think, and we do try to. We're always reminding ourselves, because we get really into the sci-fi, I think, a lot, and we're like, this is also high fantasy, and we have, of course, the 4 classes, spellcasting classes and stuff, and dragons and corporations, all that stuff to keep us, and a tripartite artificial intelligence god is kind of like all those things in one too.
That's true,
and that kind of helps keeping everything in the mix for every kind of science fiction or fantasy or both fan.
Yeah, certainly for the stuff we publish, we kind of want to give the baseline, and because it is a science fantasy game, we try to put science fiction and fantasy in there, of course, and different people in their own games might highlight one of those over the other, but we don't want to do that too much because we kind of want to give the sort of overall flavor of the thing. And I think that it's one thing that I tend to think of is because we also do Pathfinder, and Pathfinder had a lot of things from Starfinder came from Pathfinder, is if we've done something in Pathfinder, I don't really want to necessarily do it in Starfinder. So a lot of those things that we've done a lot of in Pathfinder have a much slower, being brought much slower into that, because it's like we have our own game and our own setting, and we want to play with our own new toys. So I'm always trying to encourage, like, let's come up with our own fantasy elements. Obviously, there's some really cool stuff from Pathfinder that we want to take, and we're going to continue doing that. But it's like we want to create new stuff that is Starfinder stuff.
Yeah, we did that with the troll in Alien Archive 3, which we'll just talk about. Why not? It's almost out.
Yeah. Come out this month.
Yeah, so we wanted to get trolls into Starfinder, and so there's a troll with Starfinder stats and everything, and that's cool. But then we're like, but this is Starfinder, so we also created the Void Troll, which is when you launch a troll into space, and it just keeps regenerating, like dying and regenerating, and gets this crusty radioactive shell thing going on. And some people might even weaponize those things and just launch trolls at other planets.
Is that how that started? To enter ballistic troll missiles?
Yep. That might have been
Intercontinental
Genesis, and that might still be in the book.
ICBT?
Yep. Yes, ICBT. That's right. Dang, we should have called it that.
You didn't talk to me.
It's just called the Void Troll.
All right. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So thanks, everyone.
Yes. Thanks for coming out.